Okay, so today let's talk a little bit about secession. What is secession? Secession is when a group of people or a region within a country successfully gains their independence from a country that was previously sovereign over them. While not necessarily violent, secession is a contested act, not a mutually agreed upon separation. It is also an act that must be initiated by the seceding region rather than imposed by them from the outside. I'll give you some examples of this. Think about the separation of the Czech Republic and Slovakia in 1992. This separation was largely consensual and peaceful. This was not a case of secession because both sides wanted to pursue their separate destinies separately, so to speak. And so Czechoslovakia was no more, and two states arose. When we think of the partition of East and West Germany after World War II in 1949, with East Germany being separated from the West by the Iron Curtain and eventually the Berlin Wall, we see a separation that was largely an unwilling one, where neither East Germans nor West Germans wanted to be separated, but the Soviet Union was particularly interested in carving off East Germany, and the Allies, for a variety of reasons, did not want to resist that, and so East and West Germany were created for about 50 years. Again, this doesn't sound like East Germany seceded from West Germany. It sounds a lot more like the Soviet Union and the United States decided to carve out two Germanys from the aftermath of World War II. Now, when looking at the case of South Sudan and Sudan in 2011, here it looks like we actually have a case of secession. South Sudan has for a long time tried to become independent. There were several wars and brief incidences of independence in the 1970s. Finally, there was a peace agreement in 2005 that led to a referendum in 2011 where South Sudan decided that it no longer wanted to be part of Sudan. And here you have a case where it really does look like one side wanted to leave and the other one didn't, and so South Sudan can properly be said to have seceded from Sudan in 2011. In the same way, I think it's very plausible to say that the United States, the 13 colonies of the United States, seceded from Great Britain. I think there you have a case of a revolution where one side wanted to be independent, the other side did not. Conflict ensued, and the resolution was, in fact, a case of secession. Now, from a moral point of view, we would like to know when people are morally permitted to secede and when states governing such territories are morally obligated to let them go. This is a distinct question from when secession would be a good thing or would be morally justified in some sense on balance. This is because I think it's possible to imagine that sometimes people have a right to do things for themselves that are neither good nor right. So there might be cases where even though secession would make you worse off, you may still have a right to do it. And this was something that was effectively conceded by the referendum in Scotland in 2015 and the referendum in Quebec in, I believe, 1994 or 1995, where in both cases the dominant countries, the UK and Canada, allowed a population to vote on secession, but made the case that secession would probably be quite bad for those who were seceding, and indeed, in both cases, narrow majorities voted to remain within the Union. Now, from the international state system perspective, we also want to know some other things. We want to know when the state system is permitted or even obligated to recognize new states. And we also want to know when the international community, or any state within the international community, is permitted to intervene in a secession crisis. Now, historically, this question of whether anyone has a right to secede has been tightly linked to the question of a putative right to revolution. In other words, it's been linked to the question of when may a people overthrow their government. This issue was highly politically relevant in Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries and continues to be a highly relevant issue around the world anywhere despotic governments rule. But note that a right to secession does not imply that the ruling country's government must be overthrown, only that it be cut off from some of its territory and people. So whereas revolution implies a regime change for all of the people, secession only implies a regime change for some of the people. Secession, like revolution, is a rejection of authority, And thus, to answer moral questions about secession, we have to look to theories of rightful governmental authority. Now, in political philosophy, authority means the right to create duties for others, and legitimacy means the right to enforce one's commands. So, ruling involves the right to make laws, having those laws obeyed, and enforce those laws if necessary. So, when governments are permitted to do these things, then we're going to say that governments have the right to rule. So in sum, governments have a right to rule if they have the right to make laws and the right to enforce them. Now, one aside here is that when major injustices have been perpetrated against the people residing in a part of a country, there is often a debate among those people who have been wronged between those who wish to reform the state and those who wish to secede, or if you like, those who wish to change the regime of the state in its entirety and those who wish to secede from that state and form something new. This split between what you might call the moderates who just want to reform the existing system and the extremists who want to completely overthrow the system and in fact just create a new one, it can actually make secession much harder. It makes these issues much more difficult. If you look at the American Revolutionary War, for instance, our best historical experts say that about 1/3 of the people were pro-secession, 1/3 wanted to stay within the Union, and 1/3 may have wanted some sort of compromise, maybe in the form of greater autonomy of the colonies without full secession. Okay, let's have a look at theories of authority and legitimacy to see when they say that secession might be okay. There are many different accounts of what might give states the right to rule. Briefly, though, I will focus on three. There is consent theory, also known as social contract theory. There are theories of reciprocity and gratitude. And finally, there are instrumental theories. We'll go over each one in turn. So consent theory. Consent theory, or social contract theory, says the governments rule at the pleasure of their citizens. If citizens no longer wish to be ruled, then such rule becomes illegitimate. An easy case would be if all the inhabitants, every single one of them, wanted to leave and form their own government. So consent theory would say, well, in that circumstance, you simply draw a circle around all the people who want to leave, and that's the new country, right? Of course, consent theory gets considerably more complicated when the proportion of inhabitants in a territory that wants to leave is not overwhelming. So, for instance, currently, and for a number of years now, just under 50% of Quebecois up in Quebec, 50% of Scots in Scotland, and 50% of Catalans in Catalonia, which is a part of Spain, want to secede from Canada, the UK, and Spain. What to do in those sorts of situations? You clearly have a large number of people who want to leave. A lot of people who don't want to leave aren't nationally attached. So there's lots of English people living in Scotland, and there's lots of Anglo-Canadians living in Quebec, and there's plenty of non-Catalan Spaniards living in Catalonia, all of whom are getting to vote, but who are currently just outvoting the nationalists. Consent theory also does not say that secession, when it's justified, has to be free of cost. The new nation can be made liable for debts that its population had incurred as members of other states or the former state. They may have to pay their share of capital investments. So if the government, for instance, takes out a loan to buy real estate in the seceding state, the inhabitants of the new state may be on the hook for some part of that loan. And of course, there's many other costs associated with secession, the creation of borders, and so on and so forth. So the right to secede is not a right to secede for free. Indeed, secession might be very costly. Finally, consent theory does not obligate anyone else to recognize the new states as a member of the international community. So consent theory is great for telling us when citizens are morally permitted to form their own state, and is pretty good at telling us when the country from which that territory is being carved, when they should allow it to happen. But it doesn't really say much about what the international community's attitude towards the new state ought to be, or that secessionist movement ought to be. Now, in pragmatic terms, it may be a good idea to recognize the new state, but There are examples of successfully seceded states, like, for instance, Somaliland and the northern part of Somalia, that have not obtained international recognition. In Somaliland's case, largely because the states around it are concerned about the political viability of the rest of Somalia as an independent state when it's cut off from its more successful northern region. A second way in which individuals might be obligated to a state is through obligations to reciprocate, or reciprocity. The state provides many benefits to its citizens, and its citizens would be ungrateful and perhaps wrong if they failed to return the favors that they did to them. So, for instance, when the state provides you with protection, security, tolerable administration of the laws, security of your property rights, and so on and so forth, all of those things are benefits for which theorists of reciprocity say you owe the state allegiance, obedience, and so on and so forth. A very easy case for theories of reciprocity is when the state fails to provide any benefits to some portion of its country. It abandons it, right? It doesn't administer justice, it doesn't protect it from foreign raids. In that sense, if you have received no benefits, then you owe nothing to the state. In those cases, it seems plausible to say that inhabitants of that neglected region should be allowed to secede. Of course, even relatively bad governments are a mix of benefits and burdens, and few governments really entirely abdicate their responsibilities, even though many governments favor one region of the country over another. And so then the question for theorists of reciprocity is, at what point may citizens then secede? Just when the benefits outweigh the burdens? Or maybe when the state commits extraordinary crimes, or is culpable of extraordinary negligence, as in the case of famines or genocide. As you can see, one of those lines was fairly low bar to meet, and the other one was a fairly high bar to meet. It was very difficult to meet. And the question, I think, is rendered even more difficult by the issue of loyalty, because although benefits may at times be outweighed by the burdens, at least for some part of the citizenry, surely loyalty ought to motivate people to endure some hardship for the sake of an association that, in the past, for them, has produced some benefits. So, even if the cost-benefit ratio is out of whack at any particular time for some group of citizens, it's not clear that reciprocity always permits those citizens to automatically and immediately secede. There has to be some period of time where benefits are just no longer being accrued, and where the history of benefits provided recedes into the distance before secession can really be justified. Our final theory of authority, and therefore of secession, is called instrumentalism. Now, instrumentalism about authority or legitimacy is pretty similar to reciprocity in that it considers costs and benefits, but instrumentalism tends to be forward-looking rather than backward-looking, right? It tends to look at what would be best in the future rather than trying to reciprocate for benefits received in the past. Instrumentalism says that authority and legitimacy are basically just tools to achieve human welfare. The most justified territorial units and groupings of individuals are those territorial units that best protect rights or maximize social welfare. Right? So on this view, states and borders are just tools to achieve human welfare. If they tend to do those sorts of things, then they're good, and if they tend to get in the way of those sorts of things, then they're bad and should be redrawn. Now, for a long time, political thinkers have worried about territories being too small or too large, and this is kind of an instrumentalist worry, right? Territories that are too small may not be adequately able to defend their citizens and therefore secure some of their most basic interests, and their internal markets may not be large enough to sustain a competitive economy. That is to say, maybe only a few firms would exist, leading the economy to be not particularly competitive. But on the other hand, territories that are too large may be relatively unresponsive to the needs of part of its population, particularly if that state gets captured by interests representing one area of the country. Moreover, large states may be slow to react, may be unrepresentative, and may generally be difficult to oversee and control. As an example, the United States has a very, very large area of borders to defend, whereas, of course, smaller states have smaller borders to defend, and therefore are proportionally better usually at defending them. Now, in addition to optimal territory size, territory shape can be helpful or not to the flourishing of people. So it's long been noted that countries that do not have access to the sea grow much more slowly than countries that have ports and ways to export goods more generally. Moreover, borders that coincide with some natural features like rivers and mountains are usually more defensible than other types of borders, and therefore more immune from predation. One notorious example, of course, is the partition of Czechoslovakia in 1938, where Hitler at the Munich conference got the Allies got the other European countries to allow him to take over parts of northern Czechoslovakia, but in so doing, the Czechoslovakia became completely indefensible from German armies, whereas the previous border followed mountains and was very more easily defensible by the Czech army. This enabled, of course, the Germans to later invade the rest of Czechoslovakia without any trouble whatsoever. So, some kinds of borders are just much more instrumentally conducive to a state that can defend its citizens. Now, in addition to size and shape, we might also look at the composition of a territory in terms of its population and its resources, and how that can contribute to the flourishing or atrophy of the people living in it, right? Creating borders or new borders that interfere with infrastructure networks like roads and rail and electricity, right? It used to be said that all roads lead to Rome. Well, if you have a hub and spoke type infrastructure system and you separate it, you have a whole bunch of rail lines and roads in one country that lead to another country, and none that intersect within that country, and so you have a road network that doesn't make much sense. And the same is true for electricity grids, right? Depending on where the power plants are, a distribution of power plants may be optimal from the point of view of a larger territory, but when you cut that territory up, there may be difficulty in getting electricity. Indeed, the new state may be dependent on the old state for electricity, or vice versa. The old state may be dependent on the new state for electricity, and so those issues of infrastructure can make the carving out of new territories complicated and expensive. Moreover, if you split natural resources between territories, like one territory has the upstream of a river, the other territory has the downstream of a river, that creates a whole bunch of issues. And finally, some territories just don't have a whole lot of natural resources. They tend to get cut out from natural resources, and that can be pretty bad. When a country like the Central African Republic has not much arable land, no valuable minerals, no oil, and no access to the sea. Well, what are they going to use to develop economically? Those sorts of countries appear to be seriously disadvantaged by the composition of their territory. Not necessarily because they're too large or too small, or because their territory isn't defensible in some sense, but simply because what's in that territory is just not very promising with respect to encouraging the flourishing of its inhabitants. And so all of these things, make some territories much more viable and much more conducive to the welfare of their citizens, and other territories not so much. In the case of the United States, of course, the United States has a whole lot of geographical advantages, as do countries like Russia and Australia and Canada, very large countries with many natural resources that can be used to sustain economic activity. Now, one advantage of the instrumentalist view is that it's fairly easily discussed at the international level by countries looking to decide whether or not to recognize or aid new states. So looking from the outside at the secessionist conflict, countries can try to figure out whether the new country will be viable or not, whether it will need a lot of help and international aid or not, whether the new country, again, will have the means of subsistence, whether, it makes sense from the point of view of existing infrastructure or not, or whether you just have a lot of roads leading to nowhere when you cut up the country. And so one example of this, of course, is a famous example of this is the Palestinian state in the West Bank. The Palestinian state is crisscrossed by an Israeli road network that Israelis are very reluctant give up and allow Palestinians on. It's also crisscrossed with settlements that are largely little enclaves within the West Bank. And again, all of this makes it very difficult for the Palestinian state to create, for any, well, the putative Palestinian state, the Palestinian Authority, which governs a quasi-state in the West Bank, to create public goods and create an infrastructure that makes any sense when all of their territory is or they don't have access to all of it, and there's parts of it as enclaves that they don't have control over, and so that just makes it very difficult for that state to emerge and be successful. And so these are the sorts of things that international observers have said. They've said, well, we perhaps shouldn't recognize Palestine, even though it looks like there's a people there that wants to be independent and certainly doesn't want to be ruled by Israel, but doesn't really want to be ruled by Jordan or any of the other candidates in the area. And but at the same time, how viable is the state? The argument has been made that it's not terribly viable. And the same argument was made about Scotland and about Quebec in their secession efforts, to the extent that a lot of the economy of those areas would have to be rearranged in order to accommodate the new borders. Okay, but of course there's some problems with instrumentalism, right? The view that borders are just mechanisms for the creation of welfare, of world welfare, doesn't really cohere very well with the attitudes of individuals about their country. So from the outside, it's the sort of thing that seems to have a lot of weight, but from the inside, it seems that what matters a whole lot is national self-determination. Nationalism seems to play a large role there. Most individuals are, of course, attached to their national or their ethnic communities, regardless of how convenient the distribution of people relative to territory, natural resources, and so on and so forth is. World welfare is not the first prerogative of the people trying to secede, or the country, for that matter, that's trying to prevent a secession. It's neither of those parties to the conflict really care very much about world welfare, but they may care quite a lot about their own welfare, and so that consideration, in some sense, seems to be outside the domain of the moral experience of people who are seceding. So I realize this was very quick, but by way of conclusion, we'd have to say that the degree to which secession is morally permissible depends in large part on one's prior theory of legitimate authority. The international community, of course, is often reluctant to acknowledge potential secessions because states rarely want to set a precedent for their own unhappy domestic populations, right? So if you acknowledge that some country or some part of some other country has a right to secede, and you have unhappy minorities in your own state, you don't want that to be turned against you, where your own minorities say, well, hey, you recognize this principle over here, and here we've got this identical situation going on at home, now you have to let us go. So from a realist power-seeking state perspective, secession rarely ever looks like the right solution. And we can imagine other solutions. Of course, we can imagine various forms of domestic autonomy, various forms of federalism that might decentralize decisions to keep domestic populations or regions happier than they otherwise might be. But that being said, this attitude on the part of states in the international community certainly reeks of hypocrisy to the extent that all of them have signed on to UN conventions where national self-determination is considered a primary good. Now, fortunately, that national self-determination can occur at the subnational federal level, right? So self-determination need not mean a state of your own. It may just mean more autonomy within another state. That being said, even that much freedom, right, even that much autonomy within a state is not something that many states want to allow, but it is a way of reconciling the fact that the international human rights regime is organized around the principle of national self-determination, but it is rarely in the interest of any state to acknowledge a national self-determination that is not its own. Moreover, one's attitude towards secession may also be in part dictated by one's views about the consequences of secession for all involved, right? The size, shape, and composition of territories of different states are not equally conducive to the flourishing of peoples and more or less self-sufficient economic activity. secession is almost always likely to be contested. Indeed, states threatened by secession have usually every reason to make it as costly as possible, and so that also has to be factored into the consequences of secession. Okay, so that's roughly all I have on the topic of secession. If you have any questions, of course, you know where to reach me.